Assalamu alaikum. My name is Neemat Kabutli.
And I'm Fida Abdo. Welcome to the On Purpose podcast.
This podcast addresses pertinent issues that affect Muslim communities in Australia.
We hope that this is the beginning of many conversations.
Enjoy this episode.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Today's episode of the On Purpose podcast is a conversation about agency and Muslim women. Joining us for this important conversation is Dr. Ghena Krayem. Dr. Ghena Krayem is an associate professor and senior lecturer at the Faculty of Law at the University of Sydney. Having taught for over 20 years in the areas of constitutional law, public law, and legal ethics. Dr. Ghena is also a family dispute resolution practitioner with Legal Aid New South Wales. Welcome, Dr. Ghena.
Thank you.
Dr. Ghena, you've authored several books on the understanding of the application of Sharia law in Australia, with the most recently published Muslim Women and Agency and Australian Context. Can you explain why it's so important to teach our communities about the understanding and the application of Sharia law in Australia, particularly in relation to women's rights and Islamic family law?
Look, Jazakallah khair, thank you for opening this or having this opportunity for us to talk about this issue. I think with the word Sharia, I often used to call it the S word, right? That people are afraid it's somehow a taboo thing in the Australian context. And that often then extends to even many Muslims to steer away from using that word. So I like to challenge people to think, what do we actually mean by Sharia? Do we adopt the same myths and misconceptions that, kind of the non-Muslim world has allowed us to believe about Sharia as being this divisive thing, as being something that doesn't belong in Australia? Or do we go back to what our roots are? What is Sharia? Sharia linguistically is a path to water, a path to salvation. We know it reflects our day-to-day practices. Without an understanding of Sharia, how can we as Muslims function in any society? Because Sharia extends from, yes, certainly the legal aspects, things that we commonly associate with law, but right through to all of our interactions. So our interactions with our family, with our neighbours, to the way in which we pray. So it's how we live our life. In one of our books that I've co-authored, we use the term Sharia as being a Muslim's moral compass. Mm-hmm. It kind of dictates to us, or it indicates to us our true north. So as Muslims, we will always veer slightly from the path that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has set out for us. But if we know what the Sharia provides for us, we'll find our way back. Mm-hmm. And especially when we're living in society, in the Australian society, it helps us navigate our way through. And I suppose what I've adopted all along, and certainly the academic research demonstrate this, rather than Sharia being a concept to be afraid of, something that divides us, that excludes us from Australian society, it's the exact opposite. It's actually what enables us to truly understand how we can live as productive, effective, successful Muslims in Australia. We grow as a community, we grow as individuals, we benefit the broader society. So rather than seeing it as a threat, it's the exact opposite. It's what enables us to be harmonious with the whole of society. So that's kind of in a broad way. And of course, then my research for many, many years, over 20 years, has been about Islamic family law in the Australian context. So I guess I've dedicated my research to understanding how Muslims are dealing with family law issues. And that takes us to a side of Sharia that is more like the law that we commonly understand, in particular around marriage and divorce. And what I've noticed and found very clearly is that even for Muslims who aren't practicing in the sense that, they don't find themselves, they might not even be praying or fasting, or they don't have public manifestations of their religion. But when it comes to things like marriage and divorce, they come back to community. They come back to, seeing the value of, Islamic principles and Islamic norms. Mm-hmm. And then I've explored the implications of this, particularly at the time of divorce. But divorce and marriage are very interconnected. Mm-hmm. If we don't address the issues in a holistic way, that's where we end up with the issues that we have. So it's relevant, I think, an understanding of how the broader principles of Sharia from an Islamic law, family law perspective, it's important for us to understand them in a family law context because it touches all of our lives. we're all either getting married or going through a divorce process or having children or friends or family. It's not something that's far away. It's something that we're all going to have a close proximity to at some stage. And then more specifically about Muslim women, so my most recent project has allowed me to spend years focusing on the experiences in particular of Muslim women, because they are the ones that the implications for Muslim women are far greater than for Muslim men when we're discussing this issue. So in a way, that's how my research has evolved from something really broad to something very specific, and in particular about Muslim women.
I think that's really relevant, the way that you frame that response, because sometimes, we get into what does gender equality or religious freedom exist, or how does it exist for Muslim women, or how does it coexist, intergenerationally and within different family dynamics. So I think it's really interesting that you've said, when in teaching us why it's so important, it's actually about us being comfortable with even using our own terminology and looking at the framework in which Sharia is not a foreign concept, or legal processes aren't a foreign concept, but they actually come in day to day with our own choices and our own, circumstances. I think we'll touch to both the broad and the specific as we have this conversation, because what I'd like to really understand more broadly about the concept of agency before we look at, family processes or family conflict or even divorce processes for women, is what are the common misconceptions around Muslim women's agency? Because they're often us are often seen to be or painted out as tragic figures in Australian discourse. So what are the common misconceptions around Muslim women's agency broadly within the Australian society, but also within our own Muslim communities?
Yeah, look, I think as Muslim women, we're portrayed by the extremes, neither of which reflects our reality. So we're either these oppressed victims that are in need of saving, or we're a threat to society. And, even within the academic literature, unfortunately, that's where we sit. Even within, kind of common understanding, public discourse, again, that's where the commentary sits. The only way I think we're going to get through these misconceptions, and we can all think of specific ones, Muslim women are forced to wear this thing on their head, and Muslim women can't pursue an education, and they can't participate in civil society. Essentially everything that they do is dictated to by this oppressive regime, either because that's the dictates of this religion, or because that's the dictates of men in society. So I'm just thinking the common ones of forced marriage, all these sorts of things. The only way that we are going to kind of get through this is to elevate our voices. It's not that we're not speaking. It's not that, the examples don't exist, but it's essentially finding a strategy to have those voices to be heard, to be elevated, to carve out that space that we are deserving of. And perhaps, Namet, that links us back to what agency is.
Yes.
Because agency can have many different definitions. But if in essence it's allowing women to be who they are, to at their core making decisions for themselves, freely consenting to things, and that cuts across all aspects of their lives, then in the Australian context, as Muslim women, we need to focus on the success and highlight the empowerment that Muslim women have lived for so many years in Australia. It's easy for the news or public discourse to find examples from overseas and say, oh yeah, well, this is what Muslim women is about. Like, look at how the Taliban treats women in Afghanistan, or look at what's happening in Saudi Arabia or whatever. I like to say, well, okay, let's look at Australia, because we're not experts. We're not here knowing the experiences of women all around the world. And I'm here to acknowledge that certainly there are oppressive practices that are done in the name of Islam. And that's the nature of power and abuse of power. And I'm not going to apologize for that. I'm not going to offer an excuse or an explanation even for that. That's outside of my area of expertise. But that does not define my faith. and don't take away the agency of me as an Australian Muslim woman to articulate my faith in the way that I want to do it. I don't have to defend the actions of men on the other side of the world. I can certainly support women, Muslim women all around the world, and I would, and support Muslim women's rights and their empowerment. But that doesn't take away from the fact that for many Muslim women in Australia, their faith is part of their empowerment. It is part of what makes them a really good Australian citizen as well. And I think oftentimes that gets missed in the debates and the discussion, because we kind of get thrown back at us these images, oh, but look at Muslim women, you know. And even in the Australian context, again, what community is perfect? What community doesn't have issues or problems, as if the broader community isn't dealing with serious issues around gender equality? And it's time for us to be able to step up and say, okay, like everyone else, we have these issues. But let's talk about the issue and not the faith. So the faith becomes part of, for some of us, the solution and not the problem. But I think when you can't understand that this is crucial to Muslim women's agency, we're missing a huge part of what potentially could be the solution for many Muslim women.
I think that's such an important point to make, that often women's experiences, or particularly Muslim women's experiences, are conflated with so many other geopolitical, socio-political, psychosocial issues. And that the core of the issue was always put down to their identity markers, whether it's being a woman or whether it's being a Muslim woman, as opposed to looking at the complexity and the nuance of the issues or their individual experiences. On that point, you know, we talked about, you know, being very context specific within the Australian Muslim community, and that, you know, looking for better avenues and alternatives to explore that and gender equality, and how that can actually be an empowering experience and a healing process through faith. On that point, speaking to issues of religion and culture, we know that Islam often advocates for harmonious homes and harmonious communities, and gives women the rights of economic security, education, and independent thought. The Quran very clearly states that men and women are equal in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we have over 183 ethnicities in the Australian Muslim community. So what can we do better to distinguish between the agency of Muslim women as established in the Quran versus what we learn through culture?
Yeah, I guess that's our lived experience, right? So we negotiate and navigate that on a daily basis, because we, as you know, I mean, not just as women, everyone sits at the intersectionality of so many parts of their identity. Oftentimes we're asked to, choose one over the other. And I think as Australian Muslim women, when we're using our faith as a key marker of our identity and something we always come back to, then we do elevate our religious values and practices and principles above others. So above culture doesn't make culture irrelevant. Culture can help inform even our religious practices, and you know, it's part and parcel of who we are. But then I think what we have done really well in Australia as Muslim women over many, many years is to articulate the difference between culture and religion, so that certain practices that have often been done in the name of Islam, but we know are actual patriarchal customs and cultural practices, don't get mistaken to be religious ones, because when faith is important to you, you need to know what your faith is. So we don't want to see religion, and particularly Islam, being used as an excuse to oppress women. And we know that happens, and that happens even here in the Australian context. And that's why the education of women and girls is so critical, so important, because then, you know, as women and as young women, they'll be able to say, well, I know that's not a religious practice. Actually, I know Islam would not, you know, does not stand for that. So it allows that understanding to enable women to push back against those practices that clearly are harming women or have been oppressing women for a long time. But I think there's another dimension to when we talk about agency and freedom of religion for women, is that in society more generally, faith isn't something that has been celebrated.
Yes.
Faith is something that just as a society has been relegated to a corner.
Yes.
And yet as Muslim women, we walk around, for many of us, not all, but for many of us, clearly being visibly driven by our faith.
Yes.
Right? And there are consequences to that, because suddenly you are taking your faith with you, whether you like it or not, in all your interactions.
Yeah.
And that has huge implications as well for a woman's everything that she does in her daily life, from working, from her social interactions. And on one hand, it's an incredibly empowering thing. And for Muslim women, I think many of us, we value that's a constant companion of ours. But it also takes a toll.
Yes.
And we need to acknowledge that toll in a society that is largely secular, that the public discourse is, very often not valuing faith or religion, that women are placed carrying a lot on their shoulders.
Yes.
In that public space.
It is a huge burden, and sometimes it can be, that whole representative and that tokenistic way of operating in the world, whether you choose to or not, but just by having and having faith as a personal attribute that you value can take its toll. And I guess that's why, while we focus on Muslim women in this conversation, that we actually all have a role to play as a society, as parents, as individuals, men and women, in educating our young girls, because they do, if they choose to be visibly Muslim, carry that burden and that privilege in their interactions. I just wanted to touch on, the nature of family cohesion and family conflict and divorce in our communities, because there isn't anybody that hasn't gone through that experience or known somebody that's gone through that experience. And we do find it very, very difficult to talk about divorce as a community. What can we do better to have a more open and nuanced conversation about marriage and divorce and family conflict?
I think it's not entirely separate from what we've been talking about.
Yes.
And the problem is that we, as a community, we're not even having proper conversations about women's agency in a broader context. So how can we even talk about divorce? We're not even talking about marriage, really. I mean, we know that it's an important part of our faith and it's part of everyday life. The focus tends to be on how do you organize a wedding, finding that right spouse in a materialistic way, rather than understanding, okay, this is the most important contractual, sacred contract, really, that an individual may enter into in their life. Well, what does that actually mean? Our community doesn't, unfortunately, and it's sad that I kind of have to say this, but to be honest, after 2 decades of researching this, I can't say that as a community we've elevated this issue in any way. Oftentimes the response has been, there's other competing priorities, and I get that. But it's time we invested in these issues, because they are causing problems for individuals, families, and our broader community. If we have the ability to invest in bricks and mortar, we have the ability to invest in these issues that touches on the welfare of our community. So we need it to be a whole of community, a whole of society conversation and approach, not just for the people who are getting married and do an individual marriage course, right? Because they're starting to pop up, and that's a great thing. But we need our community, we need our leaders, we need everyone to address these issues, and that's before we even kind of pull apart or work out what are the issues that are happening around family conflict. Around divorce, what does that actually mean for women? Generally, people don't realize how difficult it is until they or someone close to them attempts to go through that process. So I think at some level, and I haven't figured out how we make that a priority, how the community can appreciate that we're talking about not just people's status as being married or divorced. And I think this is one of the things that in my last bit of research became very clear to us. Something that surprised us was the impact on faith.
Yes.
right? Because people don't realize that going through a divorce actually impacts on people's faith. And if as a Muslim community we care about each other's faith, and I think that would be core to our role of supporting each other at a community level, then we need to prioritize it. I mean, imagine if we had a disease, and perhaps that's not difficult to imagine given we've just gone through COVID, that attacked people's faith, right? And it's a bit contagious, right? And it attacks people's faith. The community would all throw every dollar that they had to try and find a cure, a treatment to ensure that, oh no, we're safeguarding people's faith. But that's what happens with this issue, right? It's documented. We know that women's faith, particularly women's faith, is being impacted, but people can't seem to give it the priority that I think it deserves.
I think it's so interesting to hear you say that, because we do see that there is so much social capital, so much finances going into other manifestations of what it is for community development or community safety and cohesion. And it is sad that this doesn't really get the attention that it deserves. And I know it is a difficult issue, and no issue is the same. Each issue is unique, but having your evidence base, it's not ad hoc, it's decades of research exploring this issue, where we see that we need nuanced, culturally and religiously appropriate services to deal with these issues, because we want to mitigate harm when it comes to women's experiences, men's experiences, children's experiences in this issue. I think it's important to note that whether it's family conflict, different ranges of family conflict are quite separate or also unique to issues of family abuse or domestic abuse. And how do those intersect and interrelate, and what can we do to make sure that that impact doesn't just stop at or mitigate the harm to women, but also impacts children, because most women who experience family violence or family conflict and go through that divorce civil process or a secular religious process do have children in their care. So this is quite intergenerational, isn't it?
Absolutely. And what we know statistically from the broader Australian society, and we fit within that, and there's nothing to indicate the statistics would be any different within the community, is overwhelming majority of family law cases involve family violence or allegations of family violence. We know that, on average, one woman a week is murdered by a partner or former partner. The statistics around, 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 women being physically or emotionally abused by a partner or former partner, they're horrific statistics. And we shouldn't for a minute think that somehow in the Muslim community we're immune from those statistics. We are a part of that society. And how does that link to divorce? We know that women are least safe. I know that's probably not the right expression, but it's most dangerous for women when they choose to leave their husbands. That's the time where it is most dangerous. So if our community is intervening and providing processes, as we know it does, and we haven't explained those processes, but speaking more generally, at the time of separation or at the time of divorce, then those processes, it is an obligation on those processes to be experts in women's safety, because statistically we know it's the most dangerous time for women and children. Yet it's often relegated to a box-ticking exercise to understand what family violence is by those processes. I don't blame the imams or the leaders or the the people that are kind of working within those processes, because they've got their own constraints, and resource is a big issue. But I think what is lacking, and sometimes I feel like I want to shout it from the rooftops, is the implications are so severe. We're not talking about someone having a good experience or a bad experience, or she's just a bit demanding, or she wants an extra $50,000 in a property settlement. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about people's lives, actual safety. Some of the, obviously part of the research is interviewing women. And the research contains a lot of that lived experience from the women and from professionals that, professionals who supported women who are going through, Muslim women who are going through divorce. One woman relayed that her husband in the Islamic kind of divorce proceedings actually had a gun hidden with him that she discovered. So we're talking about things that impact women and children's physical safety. And then when we talk about the, their emotional safety, their emotional well-being, to be honest, Nama, there isn't a great understanding of that within those processes. Without describing the processes in detail, but they don't safeguard, they don't prioritize the emotional safety of women. We don't have a really good understanding of family violence beyond physical violence. Okay. Oftentimes, women are only believed if they've got evidence of a protection order or, something that demonstrates the physical violence. Mm. The other stuff, we all know how difficult it is to prove it. Yeah. And so, very often women feel that they're not believed, that they are placed in unsafe situations. And I think that's a resource. I don't think it's a deliberate attempt by anyone, leading those processes. Yeah. I don't think it's a deliberate attempt to be harmful to women. Mm-hmm. I think what I found in the research is very genuine intention to help women. Mm-hmm. And I have to say that, because we can be critical, but I think, to be fair, as these processes have developed in the last particularly 10, 15 years, there's been a really strong understanding that these processes need to help women get a religious divorce. Mm-hmm. Because women themselves feel a religious divorce is important. Yes. So in my original research, so let's say in 10, 15 years ago, there were women who struggled to get a divorce, a religious divorce. I can say from my most recent research is that the imams, both in New South Wales and Victoria, have processes that I didn't see an example where women did not get a divorce. Yeah. I'm not saying the process is easy or hard or great or desirable, mm-hmm. but the end product of getting a divorce is more achievable than it was before. Mm-hmm. And that is through an understanding of the imams making that process more amenable to getting that mm-hmm. divorce. But I ask people out there in the community, if you haven't been through that process yourself, do you know where to go and what to do? Mm. I would assume that the answer for most people would be, I'd have no idea. Where would we go? Yeah. Why do we not make that easier for women? Why isn't there more information and understanding and awareness about what their rights are? Mm. People don't even know in the community the different types of divorce. Mm-hmm. What are their availabilities? How does it apply to my situation? So without that broader knowledge, then you are at the whims or you're at the mercy of someone who's leading this process. Mm-hmm. And so I think we need to come at it from lots of different angles.
Yeah, I can see that. Your research and the depth of your understanding on this issue is really multifaceted, in the sense that I think it's important to contextualize that, we are by no means advocating for women to get divorced as a first means. In Islam, we value harmonious homes and harmonious communities. And like you said, even those who don't particularly practice or have a high level of religiosity, it intersects with culture, it intersects with religion. And so those community and civil and informal proceedings and processes are important for women and men in that process. But I think what we need to do is, as you're saying, is target it from different angles. And so even though it's great to see that there has been some improvement in not making sure that there's that systems abuse being perpetrated on women in terms of not being able to access a sheikh or not being able to do all of those things that they might need to do, there's also a community education piece that really comes in. And like you said, not shying away from actually having these conversations from a strength-based perspective, not sort of at crisis point, but actually building ourselves up as a community to say, okay, well, this is causing harm. How do we do this in a way that doesn't re-traumatize men and women? How do we do it in a way that actually prioritizes women's safety when it comes to not just physical violence, but other forms, emotional, financial abuse, psychological abuse, and then also how do we do that in a way that can protect children coming through that process as well. So there's a lot to cover there, but it's important.
I think oftentimes because it is resource intensive in a way, and the excuse is, we're doing the best that we can. Yes. And I completely appreciate that. Yeah. But where else in serious issues do we simply sit back and say, oh, we're just doing the best that we can? We know we're causing harm.
Yeah.
We know that family violence is, it's such a difficult issue in society. And as Muslims, we should be at the forefront in dealing with it. And we know we lead the way in terms of Muslim women at a community level dealing with family violence. So we have the expertise, we have it all. Then why more broadly at a community level are we content to say, well, this is just how the process is, we're just doing the best? Well, this might be difficult to hear for many, and it's not to take away or to imply that people's intentions aren't good. But quite frankly, when you see this over so many years, my response is it's not good enough. It's not good enough because we have a responsibility as a community. And if we're constructing these processes, it's sorry that it's not good enough that the resources aren't there.
Yeah.
It's not good enough that that's just simply what we can do because there's harm. It's not just, oh, we're just getting by. We're not getting by. The processes are causing harm to women.
Yeah.
And women don't know of the options available to them, either not to go through that process in the first place or how to navigate that process.
You mentioned as well in your conversation how linked the Islamic divorce process is in terms of family conflict and domestic violence when it's associated to other protection orders that are like whether it's AVOs or other things like that. That was quite shocking to me when you mentioned that and reading your community report. Could you explain a little bit about the community report and how the Islamic process and the civil process actually do influence each other in women's experiences?
I describe Muslim women as being successful legal navigators because very often they are navigating both an Australian family law system when family conflict arises. They may be navigating support systems, support services at the same time as going through what they perceive to be really important to them, and that is getting an Islamic divorce. Now, people may have different views about why do Muslim women in the first place need to go through this process. I think the research internationally demonstrates that Muslim women find value in having closure religiously around their relationship for a variety of reasons, and we actually explain them in the report as to why that's important. But then understanding how to navigate that process and how to navigate it at the same time that you might be navigating the Australian legal process as well is not an easy thing. But I tell you, Muslim women are fighting through and are actually doing it, are valuing both because there are benefits in both. Now, one of the concerns is that when you're going through an Islamic divorce process, particularly if there is family violence, that those orders are respected and for the safety of particularly the women and children. By and large, those orders within the processes, at least what we observed, is that the imams take that into account. So that's kind of a clear red line for them. Imams were really clear now that if there's physical violence, they've got certain steps that they would go through. But we know that majority of family violence occurs in the space that can't be physically seen. And we haven't even begun as a community to understand that and to help women navigate those processes. So in the absence of physical violence, you still can have the parties in the same room, yet there could be a great deal of emotional abuse, of coercion and control that is oblivious to the people who are facilitating that process. So how do we help support women through that? I think we're still a long way from that perspective. We're a long way from understanding how that sort of mistreatment and abuse can violate the sacred nature of an Islamic marriage contract. What implications does that have for divorce? What implications does that have for the way in which women approach property settlement upon divorce? What implications does that have for who has more time with the children upon divorce? So under the Australian legal system, the key concept is best interests of children with a priority of protecting children from harm. It's not unlike the Islamic context. Now, the community processes don't often get involved in disputes around parenting decisions or property. But we know anecdotally that that community leaders can influence community members. So one of the common things that I've observed is women feeling guilty if they go through the Australian process around children or around property. Because there's this kind of misconception that all a woman is entitled to is the mahar or the dowry that's agreed at the time of divorce. Yeah. We need to have a much more nuanced conversation so that it more aligns or reflects the reality of people's lives, because that's not the simple answer to what a woman is entitled to upon divorce.
Thank you, Dr. Ghena. Like, there's so much that we could really pick out of these issues, but I think it's really about the lived experience, and I think that's what's so powerful about the work that you do and the research that you do, is it really speaks to not just ideas and not just theoretical concepts, but really brings in the lived experiences that women and children and men experience going through these processes. I think one thing I would like to draw out a little bit is that in having this conversation around family conflict, around women's agency and experiences, it also comes back to it's very holistic, because in talking and able to name and identify the challenges, the experiences and the issues, it also gives us and builds our capacity as a community to also work on early intervention and prevention and community education frameworks. So it's not just sort of dealing with it at the pointy end, but also saying, well, if these are the experiences that women are going through and these are the obstacles and the challenges, then why can't we build or design messaging and communication and teaching very early on around what this looks like, so it doesn't always have to get to that point. I think it's also important if you could explain to us why this, how women's agency is very tied into issues of family violence, and particularly, you mentioned how faith can be empowering and disempowering in going through those processes. So why is the concept of agency equally as important as such intimate and personal, familial and community challenges?
I think because what we found, and I haven't qualified it before, but I should say that my recent research is there was a team of researchers, and in particular my colleague Professor Farah Ahmed from the University of Melbourne. So I should acknowledge that when I'm reflecting on that recent research, it's a team effort in getting there. I think what we found in that, what we spent time interviewing women, as said, and professionals, is that lived experience, understanding everything that matters for women, it all impacts on each other. You can't separate it out. You can't simply cordon off and say, well, this is how we're going to deal with your divorce, right? Without seeing it has a ripple effect on everything else in their lives. And if we want to approach this in a way that's going to attempt to solve this issue or attempt to provide an alternative, is to recognize the complexity of the issue of the experiences of Muslim women. One of our recommendations is that the community ought to invest in what we call a bit of a one-stop shop for families. It's not a foreign or a novel idea, because if anyone's in this space knows that we have family relationship centres, over 60 across Australia that the government funds, and it's local based. You probably have one in a local suburb. It's like a gateway to all family kind of support services. I've said for many years now, imagine if we had one that was specific to Muslim families. And again, it's not specific to Muslim women, because you can't approach this issue only looking at it from a woman's perspective, but it's specific to Muslim families, because we know that, family relationships, family dynamics, family conflict needs to be dealt with, for many Muslim families at least, in this holistic way. So we would have one place where you had the religious support, you had the legal support, you had the, kind of social work, psychological support, financial support, all of that in one place. So people aren't wandering around trying to, access different services that can be in conflict with each other, trying to navigate the different systems, because I think you alluded it to before, Naima, that itself can be a form of abuse.
Yes.
And particularly for women who aren't well supported at a community level. So one of the interesting things about the research is women had very different experiences of the community processes. For a Muslim woman who was well supported, and by well supported I mean was well integrated within the community, often had male relatives who were well-known figures in the community, their experiences of the divorce process is very different from a Muslim woman who has no support with her, who attempts to navigate that process. How can that be our Islamic principles?
Yeah.
Our Islamic principles ought to make it accessible to the most vulnerable.
Yes.
That's who we should be addressing. We shouldn't see how good it is for people who have the privilege,
Yes.
right? We should be determining it's evaluating it by how it's dealing with the most vulnerable, especially when we're dealing with these difficult issues.
That is so important. I think we can all agree that as a Muslim communities, we are very diverse. We have, very diverse communities, whether it's ethnically, whether it's in terms of our religious makeup, whether it's in terms of even, other issues and other factors within the Australian community, whether we're citizens, permanent residents, temporary citizens, access to childcare, a whole range of just social factors that impact on somebody's experience. And I just think it's so important just to draw this out a little bit in terms of dealing with the experiences from a procedural perspective, as in going through the process, but then also talking about a whole range of social issues that really, like you said, it goes both ways in terms of, housing, in terms of mental health support, in terms of parenting support, that's in terms of financial support, or a whole range of other issues, because we often just speak about one and the other separately. And I really think that recommendation is so powerful about saying, we already do this within our communities and we've been doing it for a very long time. How can we really do it better, and how can we resource and upskill and empower each other to do it in the best way and create the least harm? I think it's especially when it comes to family conflict and family violence and family cohesion, a lot of the times one's identity markers, like I said, whether it's gender identity or religious identity or cultural identities, are used as the reason that this person is experiencing harm, or the reason that this person is experiencing violence. What have you found in your research about that? Because we do sit in the broader Australian society. You've mentioned we fall into those statistics about family cohesion and family violence specifically. What does that actually look like when women are navigating those processes from the Australian processes and the Islamic processes, in terms of how Muslim women then deal with violence and also racialized discrimination, like that intersection?
Yeah, that's such an important point.
Yeah.
And it goes to the heart of the argument as to why we need specialised services for Muslim women. Yeah. Because when we looked at this issue really recently, actually looking and documenting how there was specialised services for Muslim women, and then how that evolved into a broader service provision, as you know, and what we've lost in that process, what we've lost the ability for Muslim women to have a safe space for those who need it, and again, we're generalizing here, but the research does indicate that the service needs to understand the intersectionality of Muslim women's lives for it to be effective. It's not just enough to say, here is shelter, here is food, and that's safety. Safety actually is much broader than that. If that Muslim woman does not have that place in which the food that she's been given meets her religious needs, she has a place to pray, she has a place where her religion and her spirituality is being nurtured, because that's important to her, even if she's lost the physical support of people around her. That's all critical to how she is going to deal with, and how her children are going to deal with, being away from home, if we're talking about a crisis service, for example. Having a service that is culturally also responsive is very important. What's important to certain cultures, as you mentioned, Nama, how many different cultures are represented within the Muslim community. Understanding those dynamics is actually really critical. All of that can be missed if we're facing services that will blame Muslim women. A common one: why didn't you leave him before? Men in your faith or men in your community are abusive, and the police may be interacting with a certain couple or a woman several times, right? And not understanding the dynamics as to not maybe, but I'm pretty sure she hasn't left before because it hasn't been safe to leave before, right? A woman is an expert in her own safety. She's an expert in her own story. But also one of the successes one of the reasons why having a specialised service for Muslim women is so successful is it combined both all of the immediate physical needs of women, their emotional needs, but also that advocacy that is really important. You know, why is it that, for example, it's important that a woman had her children on these specific days? Why is it important spiritually for her to, you know, to be advocating for certain practices for her kids? So all of that, we can't underestimate the importance. We should never belittle any aspect that a woman says is critical to her day-to-day living. And you can only do that if you are aware and you have specialised services. The generalised services are great at producing or dealing with providing for the emergency issues, but that's not nurturing, that's not long-lasting, that's temporary. And I think as a Muslim community, we need to get out of that temporary mindset. We're not temporary, we're established communities now in Australia. You know, it's time to think a bit more long term. It's time to strategize, because you might think, okay, well, this is just women again whinging, right? So, and let's acknowledge, some people will say that, right? The women just ranting, nagging again about women's issues. Well, what about the men? Then, you know, my response to that is, when the statistics change, well, let's change the conversation. But until that changes, then we need to be in your ear. We need to be banging those drums, not in a threatening way, not in a way in which we're attempting to take away the rights of men. Absolutely not. We're saying, actually, just look at the struggle Islamically. If the Prophet ﷺ was here with us and saw the suffering of women, how would he respond? So if you are a Muslim man, you know, listening to this, if you have privilege within our Muslim community, if you are a leader in our Muslim community, right, then when you put your head on that pillow tonight and you're pretty comfortable, then you think about what you're doing, what the implications of what you're doing and the decisions that you're making on the most vulnerable in our community. And the most vulnerable are women and children that are going through these issues. So they're not simply women's issues. No, they're not. And you know, there's going to come a day where we will all be answerable. So you can disregard this as a bit of ranting by a bunch of women. You can disregard it as saying, well, this is a whole of society problem, right? Like, this is, we know it's an issue, affects all of the Australian community. But, you know, we are so integrated within the Muslim community. We all have mothers and sisters and daughters and neighbours, you know, all of that. And if one part of the body hurts, the whole body hurts, then we are screaming in pain. And are you listening? And this is, we shouldn't expect the answers to come from the non-Muslim community, because there's a lot of resources that have been thrown out there. And I'm not even talking about money. I'm talking about shifting a mindset. I'm saying demanding that change at a community level, elevating this issue, because it is so important. That's what you need to do in your conversations in your home, elevating that as an issue. You know, don't walk away from it because you think it's not in your home. That is the courageous, I think, conversation that our community needs to have, that for a variety of reasons, no one is to blame, but we're not having it. And until we have that conversation, we're just still going to be doing the same old research.
I just think that is so powerful. We are, by the way, having a separate conversation on the role of men in the Muslim community, and also talking about advocacy within for Australian Muslims, because I think it is really important that we don't actually use this conversation to pigeonhole or pit ourselves against each other. This is actually really about harmonious families, harmonious homes, harmonious communities. Everybody deals with issues in this life, everybody deals with challenges, but how do we do that in a way that actually is healing and therapeutic and minimizes that damage, as opposed to create systems of trauma and loss of faith? And we have a lot of good in our community. It's just about
Absolutely.
harnessing it in the right way and taking an individual and collective responsibility for the way that we conduct ourselves and the way that we treat ourselves and treat others.
I think also, Namad, really well-intentioned people will often respond and say, if we're talking about equality, then all we need is to be treating men and women the same, right? And so particularly in the divorce processes, we have to treat men and women the same. That is true, but we also know an important value is protecting the most vulnerable. And so I think unapologetically we have to say until we're reducing that harm, until we're preventing that harm, then you have to have the space for these uncomfortable conversations. It's okay if we feel uncomfortable. How does anything shift?
That's right.
Right? So if you're feeling uncomfortable, that's a good thing. That's actually a good thing. Just inquire a bit further. Find out what's happening. What role do you play? There are so many social issues, I think, that if we just sat down, Islamically come down to being individual issues as well. So what is it at an individual that people can do, at an individual level that people can do to make their contribution in this space?
Yeah, thank you. That is so powerful, because often we do think of equality as sameness and we don't realise that the difference is in someone's experience. So we could both be sitting here, I could be a female, you could be a man, and we could be sitting in front of a panel of men. And my feeling of comfort and security and intimidation could be so different to how you feel, or your feeling of confidentiality or the need for privacy or what you're comfortable with could be completely different. So I think it's really important that you're really drawing out that what is equity in someone's experience and safety in someone's experience, not just in the physical processes and the mechanics of doing things. We are slightly running out of time, so I did want to ask you, because you've spent 20 years doing this work, and you've been doing this at Sydney University and nationally and internationally for quite some time. Why is it important to you that Muslim women are able to reach their full potential, that they are able to exercise power and have the resources that they need to express themselves? And why is it important that this work doesn't just sit in academic literature but makes it all the way out into people's hearts and homes?
I think because, where we started, in a way, because it affects all of us, whether we're women or men, whether we're young or old, for whatever cultural background, these issues cuts across all of that diversity. It cuts across all of that diversity, yet it can only be dealt with when we appreciate the nuances and the complexity of what makes every individual Muslim woman who she is. And as I said, the issues that we face in Australia are different than the issues that a Muslim woman will face in Indonesia or in India or whatever it might be. And so we have to just accept that as a community, we need to come together to elevate the issues that are affecting women, not because I need to be a feminist or I need to be joining protests and marches, but because my religion is full of a foundation that says we need to protect essentially women. I suppose you can't go too far from the hadith that the Prophet ﷺ said that the best amongst you are those who are best to their women. How are we reflecting on this? How are we actually embodying that? We don't need laws. We don't need Australian government to make any changes. And this always perplexes me, even in the family law space, in the kind of divorce space. It's not about any answer, any direction that comes from the secular authority or from the civil system. This is our community being able to organise it in the way that most aligns with our values. That just leaves space for women's lived experiences to be heard. Because as you said, Naima, how do we nurture that, and why is that important? It's just core to who we are. As women, we need to be strong for the women that are coming after us. This work isn't, I've realised, when I first started, it was really urgent for me, right? And I'd be like, okay, this has to change and these are my recommendations. And then 20 odd years later, I've recognized, okay, the urgency is not going to happen now, but things are changing. They have changed, they will change. But what are we going to leave behind for our daughters and our granddaughters? So inshallah that seed is sown. How it comes, how it changes, that's not in our hands. It's just up to us to do the work. The end product, we leave it to the one who has that power to change. But I guess it's just whether whether you're a man or you're a woman, there's a vested interest in there. But if you can't see it, then we're going to be here having this conversation for a while. But I hope that people can access the research, so it's not just dead sitting on shelves, which is freely available. Both the longer kind of academic research, we actually made it publicly accessible. So I believe you'll be able to provide the details of the book. And the community report, which is a more digestible form, and it's presented in such a way that it's told through the voices of the women that we interviewed. And of course, as academics, all the details are there. We're happy to support any community organisation, any community initiative that wants to build on that research. Yes, acknowledge that the research was done, but if it can lead to any change, then that would be amazing.
Thank you, Dr. Ghena, for all the work that you've done and that you continue to do yourself and with your fellow colleagues. We will put a link to the community report underneath this podcast, because we really do. I've read it. It's only 20 pages or so, and it's very easy to read. It is about women speaking for themselves in this report, and also those on the peripherals of the system. And you really do capture the diversity of our conversation in this report. So thank you for making that accessible, because as you said, I think, why you do what you do is so that we can, do it better moving forward. And I think we do have a vested interest, all of us, in making things, whether it's leaders of community organizations and women and men in that space, parents in terms of the way they have these conversations with their children, in terms of the way they create opportunities. There's a whole range of things that feeds into this conversation, and it really does come down to giving everybody the opportunity to reach their absolute full potential. I just guess bringing it back to, because we spoke a lot about what we can do internally within our community, it does link, of course, to some of the broader and specifically in Australian context that we're working with, particularly in New South Wales and Victoria. From your perspective, how far has Australia come in understanding agency and the rights of women given to Muslim women?
Look, I think not far enough is probably the short answer. We don't do well in that broad Australian context. We haven't done well in dealing with diversity. We haven't done well in dealing with our Indigenous population, our First Nations people, and the issues that they bring even in the family law context. So if we haven't even acknowledged and the injustices that it's done in that space, we certainly haven't done enough work to deal with culturally and linguistically diverse women. But having said that, though, there's still space carved out there. More information is needed. There's always been what's always been said is the need for more information, more understanding about what's happening at a community level. So I think when we provide that, when we make those arguments, when we're able to say that these processes that are operating at an informal community level actually are not threatening, they are in alignment with what's happening at an Australian level or a broader civil society level. I mean, what's interesting is people often have this view that Muslim processes or Muslim community want to set up a parallel legal process, right? There is no research. The research indicates the exact opposite. Muslim leaders are trying to see how they can be better accommodated within the Australian legal system. So actually these processes and the initiatives at a community level are trying to, sit within the Australian legal framework. So it's not threatening, it's not divisive. Actually, it's a really good example of how a multicultural community should be working. But have we done it well? No, not yet, not at all. Is there a lot more work to do? For sure, absolutely. To move beyond the stereotypes and the myths and misconceptions, first about religious law in the first place, about Sharia, secondly about Muslim women and their place themselves. I just think there's a lot more that needs to be done.
And what can we do as individuals and as a community to bridge our own knowledge and to bridge those gaps and to communicate effectively about the supports that Australian Muslim women and Australian Muslim families can do moving into the future?
Yeah, look, I think being able to organize ourselves, find the answers within our own community as well, not needing to reach out to, okay, so how might the government respond to this? Because why do we need the government to organize us? If you want to comply with your religious norms, we have that freedom, even in the family law space. We haven't had the conversation. It's a little bit more complicated or complex to know how can the Australian system help enforce or kind of safeguard the processes that are happening at an informal community level, and particularly how do you safeguard the rights of women. That's another conversation, but it is possible with an understanding of both the Islamic principles and the Australian law, and we do have individuals, we do have professionals within our community who have that understanding. That way you get the benefit of both. You're not compromising, and that's what we need for women. We need a system that doesn't compromise their rights, respects the value of their religious norms and principles and beliefs, but also provides the protection that the civil law actually provides. With the right advice, that is absolutely possible. The consequences, if we don't get it right, though, is that it is harmful for women.
Thank you, Dr. Ghena, for your time, for your expertise, for your sincerity and your dedication towards Australian Muslim communities. Thank you.
Thank you.